Most breaches are caused by exploiting oversights in basic cybersecurity fundamentals, but complex hybrid multi-cloud infrastructures make cybersecurity hygiene challenging. Red Seal can help. It shows you what's on your network, how it's connected, and the associated risk across public cloud, private cloud, and physical environments. With Red Seal, you'll get control of your cybersecurity fundamentals so you can protect your organization from the inevitable attack vectors and reduce your cyber risk. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/Red Seal. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Michael Santarcangelo. Attend RSA Conference 2020 next week, February 24th to 28th in San Francisco. Visit securityweekly.com/RSAC 2020 to sponsor an interview with us. We still have a few slots left on site, or still register using our discount code to save $150. We'll be in Broadcast Alley all week. Please stop by and come see us. We'd love to see you. Also, please join Ocean and Security Weekly at Salve Regina University Pell Center on Wednesday, March 18th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. for Ocean Cybersecurity Exchange Day. Visit securityweekly.com/Ocean, OSHEAN 2020 to register for free. Okay, Michael, let's do some leadership and communications article. We haven't done this in a little while with you, so it'll be interesting to get your take on it.
I've been looking forward to this. Matt, I always loved it when you and I did this together. We think similarly and just different enough that I always thought it was good. And I think everybody enjoyed it. So I'm super pumped, and I'm ready. Well, I took notes. Okay. I wrote stuff down. I highlighted things. I'm trying to be useful here.
All right, I love it because I don't have the other two to banter with, so I have to banter with you. This first article, I like part of this article. I didn't like part of this article, but I brought it up because I thought there was an interesting part of the story that I wanted to get out. Why 67% of companies fear they can't sustain privacy compliance. Look, we know the challenges with compliance in that, everybody gets ready for an audit, they put all the documentation together, they pass the audit, and then things change. And so there is this concern issue with compliance as a project, not as a process. Okay, I get that. But what's really interesting to me here is privacy regulations with GDPR, CCPA, and I think more coming. This is going to be one of those emerging areas that companies are going to struggle with. How do I keep data private? And the article points out that, knowing where your data is and where it's going is a big part to data privacy. And I think this is a lesson for a lot of people to learn from, because this is where I see a lot of challenges coming in the near future for CISOs and organizations in general.
Oh, I think you nailed it. And you said something I thought was interesting, right? How many organizations today know where their data is? I mean, it took me a while to understand the difference between structured and unstructured data, but unstructured data proliferates. And so, and this gives an example in it about, look, a well-intentioned employee is going to take something, they're going to put it on their laptop may or may not be compromised, it may get shifted to a home computer or not. We've seen a fair number of breaches over the last decade or so where that's exactly the case of what had happened. But you know what this also didn't talk about? It didn't talk about what harm has actually been done so far, or it talked about the costs and fines. And it did that same thing that I really wish we did less of in the world. Like, well, it's already a big number. The numbers in GDPR fines that came out so far are pathetic compared to what everybody promised they would be. And so then it says, they're going to ramp up now. It won't be lenient next year. I think if that's the approach that we're taking in the organization, it's not going to work. It's what we call beating that compliance drum over and over and over, right? And you and I like to talk about value. We like to talk about problems and solutions. It feels like we need more discussions around this at that executive level to say, hey, are we valuing this data for people? And by the way, are they expecting us to protect it? And what are our roles here? Because it's nuanced and it's not small.
Even when we saw big fines, the $5 billion Facebook fine last year, it did nothing to Facebook. It didn't change their practices. Right. It is a cultural issue. Do they want to protect data privacy or no? In their case, the answer is no, because they can monetize it and they can make more money than any fine's going to levy on them. And I think it's a really interesting dialogue for the C-suite and the board to have on this whole discussion is, do we want to protect our customers' data or don't we? And if we do, then what are the things we need to do to protect that data? And if we don't, realize you might get some fines, but you might also lose some trust with your customer base.
That's right. Or you might not. You know, the thing that we keep looking at is that people like these experiences that are tailored into them. So you can go on any of these sites and it says, hey, well, people also bought, people also read. Here's other things that people with your habits have done, and people like that. So the question I think we have to ask broader than just an executive chamber is, so where do we sit as a society? You know, privacy is not new. And in the European Union, we used to have safe harbor agreements. I was ahead of the curve, I guess. I ran a privacy consulting practice in the late 90s, early 2000. And so I'd go overseas. There weren't a ton of Americans there, but we'd sit around. And the big thing I remember was, I mean, it hasn't really changed. Like, yes, maybe fundamentally they start with the practice that if you're in business, it's your responsibility to protect it, and that person still owns their information. But then go ask them about how they operate the business, how they protect it, how they know where it is, what they're able to do about it. I don't feel like we've really changed in 20 years. And I'm wondering, are we focusing on the right stuff? Are we asking the right questions and having the right conversations? Or are we subject to legislation and requirements that are costing a ton of money, maybe even creating some new markets, but not necessarily helping us? And I'm not saying that's the case. I'd like to see that question asked a little more frequently.
Well, we've seen parts of this over our history as a security industry. So I think you're onto something, but we'll see how this plays out. But I can just see this continuing to evolve. The second article I brought in was, look, if you don't think every company is a technology company, then look at what General Mills just did. This is a cereal manufacturer, right? I mean, this is what they're known for. They hired a new chief digital and technology officer. But what I thought was really interesting is that the CIO is going to report to this new role. We're seeing some very interesting investments in C-suites where data and analytics are playing a big part into these organizations. CIOs are reporting to these new roles. These, what I see as this kind of emergence or reemergence of the chief technology officer role, but in a new way. And its potential impact to the security folks, right? Because if you think about this, a lot of CISOs still report to CIOs, which are now reporting to chief digital and technology officers. Yep. It's just an interesting trend.
Yeah, well, and you know what I noticed in this? I didn't see the word privacy written anywhere. In fact, what it specifically said was, in the past, we've relied on Nielsen Research and others to give us the data that we need, and we think we could do better ourselves now. And so we're going to go get that data, and we're going to use it to boost everything that we're doing. Right. So go back to the article we just talked about and say, okay, now, as you pointed out, maybe privacy does sit here. Maybe the type of cereal you eat is important. It's worth protecting. But I do also think you point something. There was an article, we don't reference it here, but McKinsey just ran an article on the shifting role of the CIO and how CIOs need to change their leadership to remain relevant. I read a lot of it and went, well, I think there's some good advice here for security leaders as well. And so what you're suggesting is, as the business continues to shift, the technology is still going to be important. So how we're using it, how we're discussing it, how we're describing it, I think those are the real opportunities. So if you're listening to this now, I always like looking at this to say, what conversation would you have if you suddenly had a new boss or a new boss's boss who was focused on data and analytics? How would you ask them about privacy? How would you calibrate that? Or take the interview we just had with David and Tara and say, what's the vision that you would offer, and what feedback would you look back from that conversation, and how would that shape what you do next?
Absolutely. Yes, agreed. And talking about shaping norms, this next article I thought was, it's just fascinating to me. It talks about incentives and surcharges and how they change the norms. And not only from a pricing perspective, but think about this from a compensation perspective, right? We see compensation packages changing, but this concept of by leveraging these approaches, there is a way for us to shift the standard norms, which could potentially influence greater outcomes over time. And I thought this was just fascinating article to read, because I'm like, look, you can do this from a pricing perspective when you think about how you're pricing packages. You can use this as a compensation component to really maximize what you're trying to shift in whatever that scenario is.
Well, yeah, and what I love about this is this got my mind racing, probably like it did yours. You and I always like to look at stuff from a value perspective, and of course, we both pay attention to behavior and how we shift it. So a lot of times people talk about taxes versus subsidies, right? You tax what you want less of, you subsidize what you want more of, and this is saying, yeah, that kind of works. Let's look at it differently. Let's look at surcharges versus discounts. So the discount, and it gives an example. If you don't bring a reusable bag to the shopping market, we're going to charge you, right? Surcharge, you're going to pay 10 cents a bag. Or the opposite was, if you bring your reusable bag, we'll give you a discount. What they said was discounts are interesting, but not as useful in terms of shaping the behaviors. So if you want to shift the norms or you want to change with the way that people behave, look at the surcharges that you charge. But then it had some caveats, because I got immediately thinking about, well, how do we get this to work in security? And then the corollary is, and should we? Like, who's the person in security who should derive this? And what it really talked about was go where the norm is already relatively established. And if you align your incentive structure to an established norm, you're going to get better compliance with it. And if you are completely out of sync, you will really demolish it and perhaps marginalize people. And so to me, if you read this article, and I think you should, that's the part that I would kind of focus on to say, okay, so are there things we can do here that incentivize people from a security perspective where they get a reward, but it doesn't diminish or marginalize them? And or how do we make this more of the cultural aspect, cultural norm, and then encourage people to adopt those behaviors? I think this is the kind of thing that I like paying attention to, right? It's essentially behavioral economics, but applied into the real world. And I think it has a lot of insights in there. Just don't rush off till you read the whole thing, please.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this on Security and Compliance Weekly last week about why not the spirit and the letter of the law, and why certain regulatory policies worked and didn't work, right? And I think of it in this discount surcharge kind of mentality for a second, right? One of the things I thought was pretty successful was Graham Leach Bliley in maturing the financial services sector to build mature security programs around GLBA compliance. But there was a catch. The banks could sell a lot more stuff they were regulated out of previously, right? Graham Leach Bliley gave the financial services industry a carrot in that there was an incentive to be able to sell insurance and a lot of the other things Graham Leach Bliley opened up, but at the same time put requirements in place to protect data. It was a very interesting kind of surcharge / discount incentive in this scenario, right? And if you don't balance those right, you don't necessarily get the same impact. And one could argue PCI definitely had a success, but if you look downstream for a second and you look at the smaller merchant, it really doesn't have an impact, because the discount surcharge parameters there don't work, I think, at that level. There's not enough to really influence behavior there, because they just see it as a cost and they don't really see a way to get that cost back. Anyways, just kind of a corollary to what you were saying.
No, I think you nailed it. Well, and so let's go look at your other one here. Presenting your data like a pro. What did you like best about this? I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts on it, and there's some stuff here I really liked, and there's some things here I've got some warnings maybe, but where did you see this fitting in?
Yeah, well, I always like to talk about better ways to communicate. We tend to use PowerPoints, and we tend to really clutter them with a lot of things. And I thought this article was interesting. Is when you're putting together a presentation, and this one's really focused on your data, what are some of those things you need to look at for it to really resonate and stick out with your audience? And to me, the one thing was point number 3: share one and only one major point from each chart. We try to shove too much data on there, which makes it really confusing to figure out, like, so what am I looking at? What am I supposed to gain out of this? And I think this works in communication in general. What are your 3 points you want to get across? right? This is 1 point per graph, but as a whole, if you're trying to build a story in a presentation, whether it's data related or not, what are those 3 things you want to get across to the audience? And make sure you find a way to highlight them effectively. And that's what I took out of this article the most.
Yeah, no, and it's funny. I circled the same areas. The thing I looked at in the beginning here, and what I wrote in my notes as I'm looking at it is, it said we tell stories and they're much more compelling when they're backed by numbers. Yes, true for some audiences. What it's really saying is there has to be some sort of a proof. If you're telling a story, even if it's a real story, people want to be brought into it, and they like proof. It could be social proof or it could be numbers, and that works really well. The other thing I wanted to point out, and this is another area I highlighted, said it's your job to explain how the data supports your major points, and that was their lead into the share the one thing. Yeah, but also when you do that, think about it. Like, run it by somebody else first, because we've all sat through those things where somebody takes a piece of data or they extract way too much, they interpolate way too much, and then they say, okay, now I'm going to conflate it to this other point that probably doesn't make any sense, but aha, that's my point. And everybody else looks at them and says, that's not your point. Here's the risk. If you blow it early, especially early in a slide, nobody's going to pay attention to anything else you do. They're going to think it's all fabricated and made up, and you're just trying to twist the numbers to fit your particular narrative. And by the way, maybe you are. So what I always suggest is, if you're going to use numbers, make sure you understand the numbers. And it talks in here about labeling the scales and being clear about it, et cetera. Yeah, but also be clear about your interpretation. And if you want people to go on some sort of a logical leap with you, then, as Matt just said, know the 3 points, and those need to be stepping stones, and you're going to walk them through that as you go through it. But otherwise, I think it's great. The only thing I would add, because I ask people this a lot when they do data with me, I would say, well, what surprised you about it? And here's the thing, right? We like surprises sometimes. But when it's stuff like this, especially things that delight us, if you're going through the data, especially if it's something you had access to and you're going to now present that data, I love it when somebody says, I expected to find X, and we didn't. We found Y. And so we dug deeper, and it turns out X. And this is why this is so important to us now. That's a much different story. And people will pay attention to that, especially if you start out with, we expected, but we didn't find it. We got this instead. You're going to naturally draw people in because you're showing them some of that tension, and you're explaining how you resolve that tension. And frankly, as an audience, I like that. Like, I don't want to know, oh, look, I have this point and I'm going to make it, and here's a bunch of slides that support. Now, just go tell me what you didn't expect. Tell me where it got different and how that works out. And that's the type of stuff that fascinates me. I like that a lot better. So you switched to an old school paper planner, Matt?
Yeah, I've been on an old school paper planner for a long time. I pulled this article because we see all these people, with their note takers all on their computers and their phones and all this other stuff. And I thought it was interesting. I've been a paper guy forever. I can go back to 2009 and pull out my notes from the days I was at Qualys. So here's the pros and the cons, everybody, right? I write all my notes, but I keep all of them. So if I need to go back and find something, I know exactly where it is. It's sitting in that file right over there, and I can pull it out and I can look at my notes and I can see it. I'm a very visual person. And what this article points out is that by writing it down, it actually helps us with our memory versus just using the computer sometimes or just the phone. It's not the same as actually physically writing it. And that is my big thing with me, is my notes are visual in that they help me identify what are those tasks I need to work on. They allow me to draw diagrams similar to the document you sent me on Friday, right? That's a very important part of how I process data and remember to do things.
Yep. It's it's funny you bring that up, because I read this and I went, yeah, I'm the same way. It's I've always experimented with different ways of doing stuff, and I find now that I use somewhat of a hybrid. But even though I specifically bought an iPad so that I could take notes on it, and I do take notes on it, and I take them by hand, right? So what I meant was the ability to have a digital device that allows me to travel freely, etc. I've found in the last 4 or 5 months, I have a big stack of 8.5 by 11 paper on my desk. It's a 22-pound 96 bright. It's exactly what I like. I've got 3 colors of pens that I work with, and I find that works. And what I've done is a hybrid is I have a scanner right on my phone. And when I take it, I scan it and I file it away. So to your point, I know right where something is, and a lot of times I don't even have to go looking for it too far because I remember it. Here's what I liked about this article too. It talked about having, like, I only have 3 priorities and they're written down. One of the things that's great is that you can create constraints with the space that you have. Your day has to fit on a sheet of paper. It can't go sprawling. If you look at the way people, a lot of folks, and maybe some of you listening are in this category, you're managing by your calendar. And so therefore it's either infinite or not. And what I mean by that is there's multiple things on the same time every day, and you get to, I guess, pick your poison. But also these task lists, oh man, they are so long. Now, what this doesn't talk about that I found this to be a great benefit of writing it down, when you get to the end of the week, Matt, you can go back over your week and you can actually celebrate your successes. You can see what you got done. The modern stuff, if you're all online, it hides most of it. And all you see is all the stuff you didn't get done and all the stuff going to burden you next week. And that's a miserable way to live. So I think you're onto something. That's maybe a bias on my part too, but there's a lot of science that can't completely explain. We don't know very much about how the brain works, but we know that when you write, you draw a stronger connection. We also know that when you draw a stronger connection. When you write cursive, you make an even stronger connection. So, a lot of times when we try to help people take notes, we have them do it by hand and for precisely that reason.
Unfortunately, my cursive's no good. I can't read it, so I print everything. So I only get part of the benefit, but it's the only way my brain is wired, unfortunately.
I totally get it. All right, so let's talk about top talent. I like this article, if you don't mind me starting with it. It was not what I expected. So the article title is How to Attract Top Talent in a Competitive Hiring Market. And obviously, a lot of you that are listening to this are either looking or you're looking to hire somebody for it. And what I was really kind of interesting was it talked about using content and how content is the key, and that you should look at a marketing campaign to attract and find the right people. I don't know, Matt. I think it's a genius concept, and I know that you have a background in looking at this stuff. What was your take on it? I mean, do you like this as a general idea?
So it was interesting because when I first pulled the article yesterday to include it, I was thinking it was going to give us some insight on how to go after talent, et cetera. I wasn't expecting this to turn into a marketing pitch, which is basically what it is, but it's an interesting take, right? So as I was reading the article this morning to summarize it, I said, well, I've never thought about it that way, right? We think about we've got to go out and take a job description and blast it out. And then we've got to get resumes to come in, and then we go through our filtering, and then we run them through the process. But what was interesting about this article is that content matters. Like, if you're out recruiting somebody, why would they want to come work for you? What are those pieces of collateral that puts your company in a better light to attract that talent where they actually want to come work for you? I thought that was a really interesting concept, one that I don't think recruiters use enough to really try to attract talent to come in. The second part of that then was then tailoring that message with that content to those candidates, because now I'm getting personal, but I'm also bringing in some very relevant collateral that really hopefully entices you to want to engage. I thought that was a really unique approach.
Well, and what's hidden in this is that, and think about that. So I'm going to go figure this out. That means I have to be able to explain the role that I'm hiring for, or the roles, or the team. And a lot of folks, frankly, struggle with that because we leave it, as you just said, well, I have a format and this is how I'm going to create the job description. And I fill in all these things. And maybe there's some jargon, maybe there's not, but most job descriptions don't read too exciting, and therefore that's not really what you're going to market. So I've now at some level have to go ask more about the team and the problem we're trying to solve and what that experience might be like. Now, when it talks about tailoring that message, then that means you have to know who you're looking for, right? And we see a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, at least I see a lot of stuff on LinkedIn that talks about, so you want me to have 10 years of experience, but it's an entry level position. Wait, what? How does that work? And what this does though is it forces you to say, well, who's a good fit? What are we looking for in this role, and how would we know it's a good fit, and how would we convey that to them? And the idea here is that when somebody's reading that message, instead of it being very benign or what I call a buffet message where you hope there's something for everybody, which means there's nothing for anybody, the person reading it needs to look at that and say, that's me. Oh, that's interesting. Let me read more. And then it says, okay, so now use storytelling to tell me what it's going to be like at that job. Yes, 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 yes. Let me know what I'm getting into. If I'm going to come and I'm going to interview with you, give me a taste of what to expect. Give me a taste of what the culture is going to be like. Give me a taste of the types of problems you solve or the types of problems you don't know how to solve and why I might fit or not fit. In fact, where would I fit? How would I know what I fit? How are you going to assess my performance? If you could tell me those types of a story, those things are fascinating. And I would love to see more people do that. I'll tell you bluntly, a lot of the folks who reach out to me, either because they can't find somebody or because they're trying to find a job and they can't, once you start asking them some of those questions embedded in this, okay, well, tell me more about the role you're looking for. Well, it's a security person. Oof, good luck with that. Flip side. Okay, well, what do you want to do? Well, I want to go to a job working in security. Right. That might have worked 20 years ago, but now it's a different field. Where do you fit and why? What size of company? What industry? What size of team? What position do you want? What proof do you have that you can do that? What data can you offer somebody, and how can you bring your own story to life? So I would say, to be fair, read this too if you're looking for a position and say, okay, well, what story would you tell? What's the experience of working with you like? How would somebody know? And I don't mean getting yourself prepared for a job interview. I mean just putting yourself out there and looking for it, because I always bristle when people say that we're wired for story. It's a true statement, but it doesn't mean that we're wired to be able to tell stories, let alone good stories. But what I find a lot of times is, I think, and I've been pretty clear on this, I don't think we have as much of a talent shortage as we have information inefficiency. This goes a long way towards solving that.
What I love about this is we take problem solution value to a different level, right? This isn't about a product. This is about a position, right? If you know your target, your buyer persona, right? In this case, your candidate persona, and you know the problems that the company's facing and how they want to try to solve this and the value of somebody coming to work for the company to help them solve this. It's taking that to a concept we've never really talked about, which is to the individual, to the person, to the role, is part of a recruiting campaign. I think that's so interesting. And on the flip side, if I'm a candidate looking, talk about the problems you've solved and some of the value you've provided to organizations to make yourself stand out above all the other resumes that is just, diarrhea of the mouth of all your experience. Just frame it differently. I think it changes how hiring can happen in the future. That aha hit me this morning when I actually went to summarize the article versus what I originally thought.
Yeah, no, it's a great find. It's a great ad. I was really glad you put it there, because that made a lot of sense. And I think you got it exactly right. That it's those connections. And then, as we learned in our earlier interview, now I can take this, and that's how I can help the rest of the organization understand what security does, right? I mean, the beauty of this is you can repurpose it. You might need to rewrite it or tweak it a bit, but by advertising what you're looking for and being willing to share that with your organization, they get a better sense of what your team does and the types of problems that you're looking to solve. They might know somebody. You might have an internal candidate who's excited about it, or minimally, they get a better sense of what you do, and that makes it easier when you bring those new team members in. All of that, it's great stuff.
Great stuff. And great stuff having you on the show today, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me today.
This was a treat. It's always good to talk with you, especially about value. So I thoroughly enjoy it, and it was neat to be back. And I finally got a background. For so many years I wanted to have a background, and now that I don't do the show anymore, I have a cool background. So thanks for giving me a chance to feel kind of important for a couple minutes. I appreciated that a lot. It was a blast.
Awesome. And you'll sit in anytime Jason and Paul are out, because it usually happens on Mondays that are holidays that we record. So I always need a good sidekick. So you're my top choice.
With pleasure. Happy to be your sidekick, Matt.
Awesome. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you in San Francisco next week on Business Security Weekly.